Thank you very much, Tim. I'm very pleased to be here. For those of you who are Austin Powers fans, you've just seen Dr. Evil on video, and now you're going to get Mini-Me. I thought I'd start with a bit of history. This is not the final collapse of capitalism. What we're witnessing, I think, is the kind of instability that can arise in asset markets that we've witnessed over a very long period of time. The Dutch in the 17th century could have told you about the market for tulips and how crazy that was. The Brits in the 18th century could have told you about the South Sea bubble, which was so crazy that people were willing to invest in a project the nature of which has yet to be determined. People in the US, in New York in 1929, could have told you about the stock market crash. Adam Smith, who's seen as the great guru of market fundamentalism and free market economics, would have told you about the dangerous nature of people that he called projectors and speculators. So it's almost as if policymakers, not in Australia necessarily, but in other parts of the developed world, in the US in particular, had forgotten that fundamental lesson that if the government absents itself from the scene and fails to set the stage effectively within which asset markets operate, then you will get instability, you will get bubbles, and you will get crashes. So that's kind of where we are. What should be done about it? Well, there is an immediate, a strategic, and I think a political response. The immediate response is fiscal stimulus, and there's now a global consensus which doesn't include your Liberals or the UK Conservative Party, but apart from them, there is a global consensus that fiscal stimulus is the right thing to do. You know, if the IMF are saying it, it must be the right thing to do, mustn't it? And the stimulus should be timely, large, lasting, diversified, so not all your eggs in one basket, contingent, you do more if things don't quite work out, collective, you do it across the G20, and sustainable in that you have a credible path towards returning the public finances to surplus when the recovery comes. And in large measure, those are the policies that are being applied now across the developed world. Question, as Will said, whether it's enough, whether more needs to be done, but at least policymakers are getting those things right. Now, this is the bit that I say about the Work Foundation's approach to fiscal policy that I think Wayne will like. We published a paper before the UK budget where we called for the following things. More money in the pockets of those who are most inclined to spend it. That means the poorest families. Higher benefits for the unemployed. Investment in shovel-ready projects, in particular social housing. Investment in medium-term infrastructure projects. A job guarantee for the under-25s. And more investment in education. Now, I didn't know I'd written your federal budget, but you know, I'm very grateful that I've now found that out.
Well, thank you.
Now, I think you may have got there before us, actually. So that's the immediate reaction, and that's what many governments are doing. I have to say that the Australian government is doing most of the right things and getting all of the credit, and the UK government is doing some of the right things and getting none of the credit. And that's a significant difference, and I'll come on to why in a moment. The second area is the strategic reaction. And this is where the G20 stuff is really important. It's trying to rebuild the global financial architecture to put some sand in the wheels to stop the sort of financial contagion being spread across the world that we witnessed last year. We might start by saying that something's got to be done to tackle the instability that's been present in the world economy since the 1970s. The World Bank identified 112 important crises from the late 1970s to the year 2000. Now, very often these were regional crises. The Asian crisis in the 1990s, Latin American debt defaults in the 80s, the Argentinian problem in the 90s, and so on. But that instability present in the world economy has been around for quite a while, since really the dollar was allowed to float and the anchor of Bretton Woods was pulled up. So what can you do about global imbalances? What can you do about the Chinese saving too much and the Americans borrowing too much, for example? How can you unravel that over time? What can you do at international level to establish a broad framework of financial market regulation? What should that look like? And how can you get lots of national agencies to collaborate when there are national interests to be maintained? What can you do to maintain trade openness? I heard Simon Crean's speech yesterday, what you said, Wayne. lots of ministers here talking about the importance of openness and globalisation, and I agree with that. But how can you sustain it in these difficult times? I want now to turn to the political problem. And it's fair to say that the situation in the UK is difficult, but it's difficult for Social Democrats across Europe. And while this could be a progressive moment, it doesn't appear to be a progressive moment in Europe. If anything, electorates are turning to centre-right parties, many of whom are implementing fiscal stimulus packages, but they're turning to centre-right parties rather than to centre-left and social democratic parties. And I think one of the reasons for that is that, well, partly we're in power now and the left was in power in Europe when you were in opposition here, but also it's something to do with the fact that we've forgotten how to talk about capitalism and the regulation of markets in a way which our electors, our core voters, find compelling. At the moment, the left in Europe can't really answer these questions. Why is the world the way it is? What's wrong with it? What will we do to make it better? And why should voters trust us to make it better? We can't really answer those four questions in a credible way. Partly because we've talked about globalisation being a universally good thing, benefiting everybody, almost saying, in the long run, it's great because we're all more prosperous, but as Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. The response to globalisation has been largely, it's a difficult world, the state will invest in your skills and help you navigate this more difficult world, but that's all we'll do. And we haven't really got a story about how you protect people and give them confidence, as you put it, Wayne, in conditions of change and adversity. We haven't got that in Europe at the moment. That's what we need. Will was sort of articulating some of that in his talk, but we're nowhere near there. What does this mean? Well, it means skills, certainly. It means a more active industrial policy, definitely. Identifying industries under pressure and seeing what you can do to help them, which I think was part of the debate yesterday. But also focusing on trying to give citizens the confidence that they're not simply victims of forces that they don't control, that they're active participants. And employee participation, for me, is a critical element of that, but that requires unions to modernise and reform to make sure that they are relevant to the challenges that they face in the contemporary economy. Nonetheless, I would say that Social Democrats must make the argument that unions can and should be stronger in a post-crisis world. Now, let me finish on this note. The important point, I think, for the success of progressive parties is that we are self-confident. We're not on the defensive. We're not responding to somebody else's agenda. That we're confident about our analysis. We're confident about the way in which we present arguments to the public and use language that resonates with them. You know, sometimes on the left in Europe, we're too technocratic. We talk about monetary policy, fiscal stimulus, quantitative easing. And it doesn't really make very much sense to people. You know, whereas Franklin Roosevelt would talk about expelling the money changers from the temple. He'd talk about economic royalists. He'd used populist language to reinforce a practical reformist agenda. And we haven't quite got that. And we haven't quite managed to craft an offer which is beginning to win political support across Europe. Nonetheless, we have to be confident. If we're not, things almost certainly will get worse. And I'll leave you with these thoughts of John Maynard Keynes. He said, if we consistently act on the optimistic hypothesis, this hypothesis will tend to be realised. Whilst by acting on the pessimistic hypothesis, we can keep ourselves forever in the pit of want. Thank you very much.